Sign it and leave. You have no business being here. My mother-in-law pushed 6 pages across the dining room table with 2 fingers. We had buried her husband 4 days earlier. I looked down at the document, then back at Elaine. Good morning to you too. Nobody laughed. That was fine. It hadn't really been a joke. Elaine sat at the head of the table, Bob's usual chair, wearing the same black cardigan she'd worn to the funeral luncheon. Denise, my husband's older sister, was across from me with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Mark sat beside me. That should have made me feel less alone. It didn't. Claire, he said quietly, you don't need to understand any of this. I turned my head. Of everything said in that room, that was the sentence I remembered most clearly. Not because it was the cruelest, because it came from my husband. I looked back at the first page. Family settlement and consent agreement. I'd been told we were meeting to discuss a few administrative matters involving Bob's estate. Nobody had mentioned signing anything. Denise tapped her pen against the table. Everybody else already agreed. We're waiting on you. Then you've had more time with this than I have. It's standard, she said. Standard for what? Elaine exhaled like I was a cashier asking for identification when she was clearly old enough to buy wine. Your signature allows everything to move forward. I read another few lines. There was language about consent to administration, waiver of objections, acknowledgement of certain assumptions about assets. Then a paragraph concerning Bob's interest in a small commercial property outside Westerville. I stopped there. If this is just a formality, why do you need my signature? Elaine's expression hardened. We just explained that. No, you told me to sign it. That's different. Mark shifted beside me. Claire, Dad just died. Mom doesn't need you turning this into some legal argument. I looked at him again. Did you read it? He didn't answer. Mark. I looked at it. That wasn't my question. Denise dropped her pen. Oh, for God's sake, our lawyer prepared it. I turned to her, and your lawyer told you I shouldn't read it. He said things could be handled quickly if everyone cooperated. That sounded much more plausible. Elaine tapped the bottom of the last page. Sign it. I almost smiled. Not because anything was funny. It was the sheer absurdity of being told not to read a legal document before signing it. Especially that legal document. Especially me. I flipped back to the first page. Did Dad tell you he called me 6 months ago? Nobody moved. Mark was the first to speak. Dad called you about what? That question took me back to a Tuesday afternoon in February. I was sitting in my car outside my mother's physical therapy office in Dublin, eating almonds out of a little plastic bag because I'd skipped lunch again. Bob called. We weren't phone call people. Bob and I liked each other, but our relationship was mostly Thanksgiving gravy Cleveland Browns complaints, and him asking whether I wanted him to look at whatever appliance had started making a noise. So when I saw his name, I answered immediately. Hey, Bob, everything okay? Probably. That was Bob. A one-word answer capable of making you more worried than a 5-minute explanation. Then he asked, what happens if somebody signs something and later isn't sure what they signed? What kind of something? Paperwork. Very helpful. He chuckled. Then he got quiet. He asked me about changing a will, powers of attorney, transfers between parents and adult children. Then he asked whether a person could witness a signature after the document had already been signed. That was when I stopped eating almonds. Bob, does this involve Mark or Denise? A pause. Maybe. Then I can't be your lawyer. I'm not asking you to be. If there's a family dispute brewing, you need somebody independent. I don't want to accuse anybody of anything until I know I'm not just being an old paranoid man. I remember closing my eyes for a second. Bob was 78. Still sharp enough to beat Mark at cribbage and remind everybody when the property taxes were due. But age does something cruel to confidence. Sometimes people start wondering whether a legitimate concern is simply proof they're getting old. You're allowed to ask questions about your own money, I told him. I know. Do you? Another pause. Apparently, I needed reminding. I gave him 3 names, all probate attorneys I respected, none connected to me professionally anymore. A week later, Bob texted went with Sloan. Thanks, that was it. I never asked what happened. Back at Elaine's table, Mark was staring at me. Why would Dad ask you about probate? There was no dramatic way to answer that, so I didn't try, because probate and estate law was my practice for 19 years. Denise blinked. Then she gave a short laugh. You were a probate lawyer. Yes. Elaine looked at Mark. Mark looked offended. You never told me that. That caught me off guard. You knew I practiced law. I knew you worked at a firm. I was an attorney at the firm, Mark. You never said you did estates. I'm fairly sure I did. When, probably sometime during the 11 years we've been married. Denise looked away. Even she seemed to understand that hadn't helped him. The truth was less dramatic than everybody wanted it to be. I had practiced in Cleveland for almost 2 decades. After my first marriage ended and my mother began needing more help, I stepped away from full-time practice. By the time I married Mark, I was doing contract research and occasional remote work. His family never asked much about it. Elaine once described my old career as that office thing Claire used to do. I corrected her exactly once. Apparently, nobody took notes. I closed the agreement. I'm not signing this today. Elaine stared at me. Then don't expect this family to forget what you're doing. What exactly am I doing? Making things harder when my husband has been dead 4 days. That one landed, because grief was real. Elaine had lost the man she'd slept beside for 52 years. I wasn't going to pretend her pain was some performance just because she was treating me badly. So I kept my voice down. I'm sorry you're going through this. I loved Bob too. But I'm not signing 6 pages I was handed 10 minutes ago. Denise muttered, unbelievable. I stood. Mark followed me outside. We made it halfway home before he spoke. You could have just signed it and let Mom get through 1 week without another problem. I watched subdivisions and strip malls pass outside the window. Did you read it? He tightened both hands on the steering wheel. There was my answer. So why I asked, were you asking me to sign it? He drove another mile without saying anything. That night he slept downstairs. Around 11 I plugged my phone into the charger and noticed a voicemail from a Columbus number I didn't recognize. I played it. Ms. Bennett, this is Margaret Sloan. I represented Robert Bennett. He left instructions that I contact you after his death. Please call me when you're able. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to it twice. Bob hadn't just taken my recommendation. He had left my name behind. I called Margaret Sloan the next morning from my car, not because I was trying to be dramatic. I just didn't want Mark overhearing half a legal conversation through the kitchen wall and deciding he understood all of it. She answered on the second ring. Claire Bennett, yes. I'm glad you called. Her voice was calm, practiced. The kind of voice you want when someone is about to tell you something complicated. I got your message, I said. You represented Bob, I did. How recently until his death? That told me more than I expected. I looked through the windshield at the parking lot outside a Kroger in Dublin. People were pushing carts, loading bottled water, arguing with children over cereal. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Meanwhile, my dead father-in-law apparently had a legal life none of us knew about. Margaret said, "Would you rather discuss this in person?" Yes. Good. Some of it shouldn't be done by phone. That sentence did nothing for my blood pressure. Her office was downtown in an older brick building near Broad Street. No marble lobby, no giant brass nameplate. Just a receptionist of ficus that had seen better years and framed photographs of Margaret with what looked like 3 generations of the same golden retriever. She came out herself. She was around 60, silver haircut just below her ears, navy slacks, low heels. Claire. Margaret. We shook hands. Her office had 3 banker's boxes stacked beside a bookcase. I looked at them. She noticed. Those aren't all, Bob. Good. 2 are. Less good. That earned the smallest smile. Once we sat down, I skipped the warm-up. Did Bob change his will? Yes. Did he leave me something? Margaret gave me a look over the top of her glasses. If by something you mean a hidden fortune. No, I laughed despite myself. Thank God. That's not the reaction I usually get. I've had enough surprises this week. She folded her hands. Bob's primary concern was Elaine. He wanted her financially protected for the rest of her life. That sounds like him. It does. He didn't trust Denise. Margaret paused. That's more complicated. Of course it was. Family money is almost always more complicated than anybody wants it to be. Margaret explained that Bob had brought her several years of bank records. Over time, roughly $140,000 had gone toward Denise, some direct checks, some mortgage help, a few larger transfers. I winced. That sounds bad when you say the number all at once. It does, Margaret said. But much of it wasn't improper. That mattered. Bob had always helped Denise. After her divorce, when she nearly lost her house, Bob covered 2 mortgage payments. When her furnace died in January, he paid for that too. He'd even helped with her son's tuition for a couple semesters. He complained about it. Then he wrote the check. That was Bob. So what worried him, I asked. Later, transactions. Margaret opened a folder. She didn't hand me anything yet. One involved his interest in a commercial building. Another involved an authorization he didn't clearly remember signing. I sat back. Did he think Denise forged his name? He never said that. What did he say? That he was no longer certain every document put in front of him matched what he believed he'd agreed to? That was a very Bob way to accuse nobody while worrying about everybody. I thought about that phone call. The way he'd said, I don't want to accuse anybody until I know I'm not just being an old paranoid man. Why didn't he tell Elaine Margaret reached for a legal pad? He wrote something about that. She found a page and read from her notes. If I tell Elaine before I know what's true, she'll call Denise. Then we'll have a family war over something I might be wrong about. I closed my eyes for a second. That sounded exactly like him. Not secretive. Cautious. Maybe too cautious. What did he change? Margaret leaned back. Not as much as your family probably assumes. She told me Bob had replaced Mark as his nominated personal representative with an independent fiduciary. That got my attention. He removed Mark from that role, yes. Why he wanted the accounting handled by somebody without family pressure. Fair enough. He also updated the trust arrangement protecting Elaine. Elaine would continue to have the support Bob intended. Mark and Denise were still beneficiaries. No one had been dramatically cut out. No one had been secretly crowned king. And me, I asked. Margaret nodded. You have a limited supervisory role under the trust. I stared at her. Why? Because Bob asked for it. That does not answer my question. This time, Margaret smiled. He said you were the only person involved who didn't need the money. I let out a breath. That is both flattering and insulting. I told him something similar. I looked down at my hands. He never told me. No, why not? I suspect he thought telling you would make you uncomfortable. He was right. Margaret's expression softened. He trusted your judgment. That was harder to hear than I expected. Bob wasn't affectionate in speeches. He'd fix your garage door. He'd fill your gas tank if he borrowed your car. He'd show up 20 minutes early with a flashlight. That was how he loved people. I cleared my throat. So Elaine's agreement problematic. I wouldn't sign it, neither would I. That helped. Is it based on the older plan? Margaret nodded. At least partly. So they may not know he changed things. Correct. I sat there for a moment. Then I asked, does Mark know any of this? Not from me. That answer stayed with me all afternoon. When I got home, Mark was in the kitchen reheating leftover chicken. He looked tired. So did I. Where were you? He asked. Meeting Margaret Sloan. His fork stopped halfway to his plate. Dad's lawyer. Yes. What did she want to explain what Dad changed? He leaned against the counter. How much did he leave you? It came out too fast. I didn't answer right away. Then I said, nothing. His shoulders dropped, just slightly. But I saw it. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. He didn't leave me money, Mark. I didn't say. You didn't have to. He looked irritated now. Claire, come on. No, you asked me the first question that came into your head. What was I supposed to ask? How about whether your mother's protected? That shut him up. She is, I said. Dad had made sure of that. He nodded. Okay, But he also ordered an independent accounting of some transactions involving Denise. His face changed again. There it is. This is what lawyers do. I actually laughed. Excuse me. You take a family problem and turn it into a case. Your father hired the lawyer, Dad helped Denise all the time. I know. Then why are they digging through her life? They're not. They're reviewing his transactions, you know what I mean. No, Mark. I'm starting to think I don't. He paced once across the kitchen. Denise was in a bad place after the divorce. I know that too. Dad gave her money. Yes, so maybe everybody could stop acting like she robbed a bank. I'm not acting like anything. Margaret specifically said many of the transfers were legitimate. Then what are they looking for? That's what an accounting is for. He shook his head. Unbelievable. I watched him for a second. Why are you this upset I'm not? He was. I just didn't know why yet. That evening, Elaine called 2 relatives before dinner and 3 more after. By Thursday, Mark's cousin Susan had texted him asking whether I was trying to take control of Bob's estate. An aunt who normally sent me pictures of her roses suddenly stopped responding. Apparently, I had become a legal coup in sensible shoes. Then Margaret emailed the estate documents. I opened them at my desk. The first thing I noticed wasn't the language, it was the date. The will Elaine's agreement seemed to rely on had been signed 2 years earlier. The document on my screen had been executed 4 months before Bob died. I called Margaret. Elaine doesn't know, does she? No, Denise. She will tomorrow. I looked toward the living room where Mark was watching television with the volume too high. Tomorrow his family was going to learn that Bob had changed more than paperwork. He had changed who got to control the questions. Nobody gathered in a mahogany-paneled room while a lawyer dramatically read Bob's will aloud. Real life is rarely that considerate. We met in a conference room on the 6th floor of Margaret's building under fluorescent lights with a tray of grocery store muffins nobody touched. Elaine arrived with Denise. Mark and I came separately, which he clearly hated. You could have ridden with me, he said near the elevators. I could have. That was all I gave him. Margaret introduced Daniel Reeves, the independent fiduciary Bob had appointed. Daniel was in his late 50s with reading glasses hanging from his shirt collar, and the patient expression of a man who had spent decades explaining to families that being related to someone did not make you their accountant. Elaine sat down. Can we please get this over with? Margaret nodded. That's the goal. Denise glanced at me. I could tell what she expected. A bombshell. Bob had left Claire the building. Bob had secretly given Claire half the estate. Bob had rewarded his daughter-in-law while betraying his own children. Instead, Margaret spent the next 20 minutes explaining an estate plan that was almost aggressively reasonable. Elaine remained protected. The house arrangements were essentially unchanged. Her financial support continued through the structure Bob had created. Mark and Denise remained beneficiaries. Nobody had been disinherited. Nobody had been replaced by me. When Margaret finished that part, Denise frowned. So what exactly did he change? Daniel answered. Administration and oversight. What does that mean? It means I'll be handling certain estate and trust matters independently. Denise stared at him. Yes. Why? Because your father appointed me. Mark leaned forward. Dad originally had me doing that. He did, Margaret said. He changed it. I looked at Mark. His face went still. That was the first moment I understood this was hurting him in a way money couldn't. Bob hadn't taken away an inheritance. He had taken away trust. Denise folded her arms. And what does Claire have to do with any of this? Margaret explained my limited supervisory role in plain English. I wasn't running the trust. I wasn't controlling Elaine's money. I wasn't deciding who got what. Under certain circumstances, I had a limited role involving oversight and replacement of a trustee. Elaine looked at me. You knew about this not until yesterday. Convenient. For whom she didn't answer. Daniel opened a folder. There is another provision we need to discuss. Denise sighed. Of course there is. Your father requested an accounting of several transactions involving his assets. Her expression changed. What transactions? We're determining that. So some stranger gets to go through Dad's bank accounts. Daniel didn't react to the insult. Your father instructed me to review them. My father would never want somebody digging through his finances. Margaret spoke before Daniel could. Denise, he signed the instructions. That quieted the room for about 3 seconds. Then Elaine said Bob gave Denise money all the time. I understand, Daniel said. He helped his children. That's what fathers do. No one is disputing that. It was the first sensible thing anybody had said about the money. Over the next several weeks, Daniel's accounting began separating things that should never have been lumped together. A check Bob wrote Denise when her furnace failed, clearly authorized. Tuition payments for his grandson, authorized. 2 mortgage payments after Denise's divorce, also authorized. I said so when Elaine complained that we were treating every dollar Bob had given his daughter like stolen property. We aren't, I told her. She looked surprised. Excuse me. Bob was allowed to give Denise his money. If the records show he did, then that's the end of it. Denise studied me. I think she'd been prepared to fight a version of me that didn't exist. The problem was that not every transaction looked like those. One afternoon, Daniel sent several documents through counsel for review. I was sitting at my kitchen table when I opened them. The commercial property appeared again. Bob had owned a minority interest in a small building outside Westerville for years. Nothing glamorous. A dental lab occupied one unit, an HVAC supplier another, and Bob used to joke that the parking lot produced more headaches than rent. One document concerned authority related to Bob's interest. I read the first page, then the second. At the bottom was Bob's signature. Below it was a witness line. Mark Bennett. I stared at my husband's name. There are moments when your brain starts offering explanations before you've even asked for them. Maybe I misunderstood the document. Maybe Mark had mentioned it and I'd forgotten. Maybe Bob signed it at our house. Maybe there was nothing wrong with it. I didn't call Mark. I waited. That evening he came home carrying takeout from a barbecue place he liked. Got you brisket. Thanks. He must have heard something in my voice. What I had printed the document. I slid it across the kitchen counter. Did you witness Bob sign this? Mark looked down. His face told me before his mouth did. Where did you get that? That's not an answer. He put the takeout bag down. Claire. Did you see your father sign that document? He rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. No, I waited. Denise brought it over. When last fall. What did she say that Dad had already signed it? He forgot to get the witness part done. I stared at him. And you signed as the witness. She said he'd signed it. That isn't what witnessing means. I know that now. I couldn't help myself. You knew it then. His jaw tightened. Don't do that. Do it. Talk to me like I'm on the witness stand. I pointed at the page. Mark, you literally signed a witness line. Don't say it like that. For one strange second, I almost laughed. How would you like me to say it? He turned away. Denise was having problems. Dad was helping her. He always helped her. That has nothing to do with whether you watched him sign this. I thought I was fixing paperwork. By claiming you saw something you didn't see, I made a mistake. Yes. He turned back toward me. Apparently he expected an argument. I didn't give him one. I asked the question that mattered more. When your mother put that settlement agreement in front of me, did you know Dad had started questioning documents involving Denise? His eyes moved away from mine. Not exactly. What did you know? I knew Dad had been asking questions. What kind, I don't know. Mark. He asked Denise about some paperwork. She told me he was getting confused. And you believed her. I didn't know what to believe. That was possible. It was also not enough. So when your mother told me to sign and leave, you knew there was at least a chance this document would come up. I didn't know that. But you knew something might. He didn't answer. I thought back to the dining room. Elaine tapping the signature line. Denise saying everybody was waiting on me. Mark saying I didn't need to understand. Suddenly his impatience looked different. You knew enough to know I shouldn't sign that agreement without reading it. Claire, if this turns into some giant legal fight, Denise could lose everything. I looked at him. There it was. Not a conspiracy. Not some master plan. Something much more ordinary. He was scared. And he'd decided I was the safest person to make pay for that fear. So you decided I could lose something instead. His forehead creased. What are you talking about? You weren't going to lose money. I wasn't talking about money. He went quiet. I picked up the document. I need you to understand something. I'm not your lawyer. I'm not Denise's lawyer. And I'm not going to help you explain this away. I didn't ask you to. No, you asked me to sign something so nobody would have to explain anything at all. That isn't fair. Maybe it wasn't completely fair. I was angry enough to know I shouldn't pretend I understood every motive he'd had. But I understood the result. When his family had needed somebody to absorb the discomfort, Mark had looked at me. Because I was reasonable. Because I usually calmed down. Because I didn't make scenes. Because somewhere along the way, being the reasonable wife had become permission to treat me as the expendable one. That night, I went upstairs early. Mark followed 10 minutes later. Claire, can we talk? Not tonight. You can't just shut me out. I looked at him for a moment. Then I closed the bedroom door, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, I turned the lock. 3 days after I locked the bedroom door, Denise's attorney sent a letter questioning whether I should have any role in Bob's trust at all. Elaine called me before I'd even finished reading it. Well, she said, looks like Bob didn't trust you as much as you thought. I was standing in the laundry room with one of Mark's socks in my hand. There are moments in life when the setting refuses to cooperate with the drama. I never said Bob trusted me more than anyone. You certainly acted like it. No, Elaine, I refused to sign something I hadn't read. And look what that started. I put the sock down. What exactly do you think I started this whole investigation? People going through our accounts. Denise having to explain every check her father ever wrote her. Bob requested the accounting before he died. Silence. Elaine had heard that before. She simply preferred versions of reality where I was easier to blame. Finally, she said, Denise's lawyer says you have a conflict of interest. He may be right about part of that. That stopped her. What I said, he may have a point. She clearly had no prepared response for agreement. I told her I needed to speak with Margaret and ended the call. Margaret was less alarmed than I was. We met that afternoon. Can they remove me? I asked. They can challenge your participation. Whether they'd succeed is another question. Because I'm married to Mark. More specifically, because Mark is a beneficiary and his conduct may now intersect with a disputed transaction. I stared at the legal pad between us. It was strange. 6 months earlier, I hadn't known Bob intended to give me any role at all. Now the possibility of losing part of that role felt personal, not because I wanted authority, because Bob had made a choice, and I didn't want Denise rewriting it simply because she disliked that choice. Margaret must have read something in my face. Bob knew you were married to Mark when he appointed you, Claire. That wasn't exactly hidden information, I'd hope not, but validity and prudence are two different questions. If Mark's interests become adverse to the trust, there may be decisions where it would be cleaner for you not to participate. Would stepping back in those areas protect the process? Yes. Then I stepped back. Margaret paused. You don't want to think about it. I just did. You understand, Denise will call it a victory. Denise calls finding a close parking space a victory. Margaret smiled. I'm serious. So am I. If my participation gives them an excuse to attack the process instead of answering the questions, I don't need to participate in those decisions. That was the difference nobody in Mark's family seemed to understand. I wasn't trying to win Bob's estate. There was nothing in it I wanted. 2 days later, Denise called. Not texted. Called. Can we meet? Why? Because every conversation doesn't need 6 lawyers. There aren't 6 lawyers, you know what I mean. Unfortunately, I did. We met at a Panera halfway between our houses. Denise was already there with coffee when I arrived. No Elaine, no Mark, no legal pads. She looked tired. Really tired. For the first 10 minutes, we barely talked about Bob. Denise talked about her divorce. I'd known the broad version. I hadn't known the humiliating details. Her ex-husband had kept the small business they'd built together. The settlement hadn't gone the way she'd expected. She'd refinanced the house at exactly the wrong time. Then she'd spent nearly a year pretending everything was fine because her son was still living with her. "Do you know what it's like," she said, "to be 55 years old and call your father because your mortgage is due?" I stirred my coffee. "No, I hated it. I believe you." She looked almost irritated by that answer. "I wasn't stealing from him. I haven't said you were. Everybody's treating me like I cleaned out his accounts. They aren't. Some stranger is going through years of my life. He's going through Bob's accounts. You know what I mean." That phrase apparently ran in the family. Denise leaned closer. "Dad was going to help me with the property anyway." "Then why didn't you ask him to sign the document again?" She sat back. He already signed it. "Then why did Mark have to witness it afterward?" Her mouth tightened. "You've already decided what happened." "No. That's why we're still asking questions." She looked toward the window. I could see the anger in her, but there was embarrassment underneath it. That mattered to me. It just didn't erase anything. "I was drowning, Claire. I understand that. No, you don't. You're right. I don't know what your divorce felt like. I don't know what it felt like to call Bob for money." She looked at me. "But I do know what shame feels like," I said. "And shame doesn't turn somebody else's signature into yours." Her face changed. "I never forged Dad's name. I didn't say you did. You implied it." "No, I asked why you didn't have him sign the paperwork properly if he agreed with it." She grabbed her purse. "This was a mistake." "Probably." She stood, then stopped. "You think you're better than us." "No, Denise, I meant it. I think your father deserved to know what he was signing." She left without saying goodbye. The following week, Margaret let me review portions of Bob's memorandum that were relevant to the administration. It wasn't a letter. That made it harder somehow. Just dated notes, phone calls, questions, things he wanted to remember. Then I found Mark's name. "Mark knows Denise had him witness something. He won't tell me what. I read it twice. Bob had known. Maybe not everything, but enough to know his son was avoiding him." A few lines later was another entry, called Claire. "She told me not to sign anything I don't understand. Good advice. Should have taken it sooner." I stopped there. That was Bob. No grand declaration. No sentimental paragraph about how I was the daughter he'd never had. Just 8 or 9 words of approval buried between notes about bank statements. I had to put the pages down anyway. That evening, Mark came home late. He'd finally hired his own attorney. I was relieved. "How bad is it?" I asked. He loosened his tie. He doesn't know yet. At least that's an honest answer. Mark didn't appreciate that. My lawyer said depending on what the document was used for, what I knew, all of that, I could have a real problem. I nodded. He told me not to delete anything, not to talk to Denise about what I'm going to say, not to try to get our stories straight. Good advice. Mark looked at me. "Can you please stop talking to me like a lawyer for 5 minutes? I'm not. Then tell me what I should do." There it was. After years of barely caring what kind of law I'd practiced, suddenly my expertise had become very interesting. "You should listen to your attorney." "Claire, what do you want from me?" "I don't know, help. I can't be the person who helps you minimize something I'm involved in dealing with on the other side." His expression hardened. "So I'm your enemy now?" No, I stood. "You're my husband. That's what makes this worse." The next morning I packed 2 suitcases. Not everything. That mattered to me. I wasn't staging an exit. I needed somewhere I could think without measuring every sentence against Mark's fear. I rented a furnished apartment closer to my mother's assisted living community. Mark watched from the bedroom doorway while I folded sweaters. "Are you leaving me? I'm leaving the house." "That's not what I asked." "I don't know the answer to what you asked. That was the truth." A week later, Mark's attorney told him he needed to provide a complete statement before the upcoming mediation and accounting conference. That night, Denise texted him. "I know because Mark showed me later. Call me before you tell them anything." For once he didn't. He typed, "I'm telling my lawyer the truth." Then he put the phone face down. It wasn't redemption. But it was the first time I'd seen him choose a difficult truth when an easier lie was sitting right there waiting for him. By the time we got to mediation, nobody was pretending this was about making probate simple anymore. The conference room was 2 floors below Margaret's office. Beige walls, long table, bad coffee, the kind of room designed to make 6 hours feel like 9. Mark was already there with his attorney when I arrived. He stood when he saw me. Hey, we were still married, still speaking, still living apart. There isn't a greeting card for that stage. Elaine came in with Denise a few minutes later. They sat together, although there was an empty chair between them. That was new. Margaret sat near Daniel Reeves, the independent fiduciary. Denise had her own attorney. Elaine had counsel advising her on the trust issues, though she seemed personally offended by the idea that anybody in the room knew more than she did. Daniel began. He reminded everyone that the purpose wasn't to punish anybody. It was to determine which transactions Bob had authorized, resolve the disputed ones, and administer his estate according to the documents he'd actually signed. Elaine muttered, "Bob would have hated this." Margaret said, "That's why he left instructions." Elaine didn't answer. We started with the easy transactions: tuition, authorized; the furnace, authorized; mortgage assistance, authorized. Several checks Bob had written directly to Denise. No dispute. I watched some of the tension leave Denise's shoulders. Then Daniel reached the commercial property document. It was remarkable how quickly a room could change. Mark's attorney leaned toward him and whispered something. Mark nodded. Then he spoke. "I signed as a witness." Denise stared down at the table. Mark continued. "I did not see Dad sign it." Elaine closed her eyes. Mark's attorney said nothing. He'd obviously told him this part had to come from him. "Denise brought it to my house," Mark said. "She told me Dad had signed it and they'd forgotten to have the signature witnessed." Denise looked up. "That's not exactly what I said." Mark turned toward her. "Yes, it is. I said Dad wanted the paperwork finished. You said he'd already signed it." "He had." Mark swallowed. "I didn't see him do it. I shouldn't have signed the witness line." No excuse followed. "No, I was helping. No, everybody does things like that. Just I shouldn't have done it." I hated how much I needed to hear him say that. Daniel asked a few questions about dates. Mark answered them. Then Denise's attorney began explaining that Bob had a long history of financially assisting his daughter and had discussed helping her through the commercial property. Nobody disputed that. The problem was the document. Denise became increasingly frustrated. Finally, she said Mark knew what we were doing. Mark looked at her. "I knew about that document. You knew more than that." "No, I didn't." She laughed. "Oh, please. You knew Dad was helping me." "So did everybody. You knew what the property was for. I knew what you told me." Denise turned toward Daniel. "He's acting like I showed up at his house with some mysterious piece of paper." "We talked about this stuff." Mark's attorney interrupted. General conversations about your father's financial support are not the same as knowledge of a specific transaction." Denise pointed toward Mark. "He knew." Mark shook his head. "I didn't." "Yes, you did." And then before I could say anything, Elaine spoke. "Yes, Denise." "He didn't." Everybody looked at her. Denise blinked. "Mom, don't mom me." Elaine's voice was low. "Your brother did one stupid thing. Don't make him responsible for everything you did." Denise stared at her. "You're taking his side now. I'm telling the truth. You knew Dad was helping me. Yes, you knew I had access to the accounts. Yes, then don't sit there and act like I knew you had access because your father gave it to you for certain things." Elaine's mouth tightened. "I did not know every single thing you were doing." That was the first real crack between them. Not because Elaine had suddenly discovered morality. She still believed Denise had been treated too harshly. She still believed Bob would have eventually forgiven most of it. But she wasn't willing to let her daughter rewrite everything to save herself. Daniel asked Elaine when she first realized Bob was questioning the transactions. "Toward the end of last year." "And what did you do?" Elaine stared at her hands. "Nothing." "Why?" "Because they'd been fighting, Bob and Denise." "Yes, and I thought—" She stopped. Margaret waited. Elaine finally said, "I thought if Bob calmed down, he'd help her again." Denise looked wounded. Mom. Elaine didn't look at her. I didn't want him cutting you off. There it was. Not a criminal mastermind. A mother protecting her grown daughter long after protection had stopped being helpful. Daniel asked, "So when Bob began questioning the paperwork, you chose not to pursue those concerns with him?" Elaine's eyes lifted. I had just lost my husband. Now I'm sitting in a room full of people dissecting every mistake my family ever made. Nobody answered. Then she looked directly at me. And she gets to sit there judging all of us. I kept my voice even. "I'm not judging you. You've been judging us since the day Bob died. No, I've been asking what he wanted. You think you're smarter than everyone because you're a lawyer. No, I meant that. Bob was smarter than all of us." Elaine gave a bitter laugh. "Oh, please." He stopped trusting people who kept telling him not to ask questions. That landed. Elaine's eyes sharpened. "You could have signed that paper at my house and none of this would have happened." I stared at her. For a second I was back at that dining room table. Bob's chair, her finger tapping the signature line. Mark, beside me. "You don't need to understand any of this." "No," I said. "That's why you wanted me to sign it before anyone explained it." Elaine opened her mouth, then closed it. Daniel moved the conversation forward. The eventual resolution wasn't dramatic enough for television. It was probably better for that reason. The payments Bob had clearly authorized stayed exactly what they were: gifts and assistance to his daughter. The disputed amounts were treated separately. Denise agreed to adjustments against her eventual interest and a repayment arrangement on part of the money. Bob's commercial property interest remained protected under the newer structure. Elaine remained financially secure. Mark agreed to cooperate fully with any remaining review. Nobody got everything they wanted, which is usually how you know a settlement has some chance of working. When we finally walked out, Mark caught up with me near the elevators. "Claire." I stopped. He looked exhausted. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." He took a second. "I knew enough to know you shouldn't sign that agreement." I'd already known that. Hearing him say it was different. I didn't know everything, he continued. But I knew Dad had questions. I knew Denise was scared. I knew that if you started reading you'd ask things nobody wanted asked. Then why did you do it? He looked at the floor. Because disappointing you was easier than standing up to them. I didn't say anything. He looked back at me. "I knew you'd be angry. But I thought you'd eventually understand." That almost hurt more. "How long has that been true?" He knew exactly what I meant. Not the estate. Us. He didn't answer. The elevator arrived. Neither of us got in. Finally, Mark's, "Can we go home?" For one foolish second, part of me wanted to say yes. 11 years doesn't disappear because you're angry. I missed my kitchen, my pillow, Sunday coffee with him. The ordinary pieces of a marriage don't stop belonging to you just because the marriage is in trouble. You can, I said. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you're going home. I'm going back to the apartment." His face fell. I told the truth. "You did. What else am I supposed to do?" I looked at him. "Keep doing it." He waited. "That's where fixing this starts, Mark. It isn't where it ends." This time he didn't argue. And strangely enough, that was the first thing all day that gave me any hope. The estate did not end with everybody shaking hands and agreeing to put the unpleasantness behind us. That would have required a different family. It took months. There were statements to reconcile, property questions to settle, and enough emails from attorneys to make me remember exactly why I hadn't missed practicing probate full-time. Denise eventually sold a little vacation place she'd owned near Indian Lake. Calling it a vacation place was generous. It was a 2-bedroom cottage with a screened porch that leaned slightly to the left, and a dock Bob had repaired at least 4 times. Part of the proceeds went toward the financial adjustment she'd agreed to. She and I never had a big reconciliation. The first time we saw each other after mediation was at Mark's cousin's retirement party. Denise came over while I was standing near the dessert table. Hi. She looked at the sheet cake. "Is that carrot?" "I think so." "I hate carrot cake. I remember. That was our conversation, and frankly it was progress. Elaine was harder. She never apologized for putting that agreement in front of me. She never admitted she had been wrong to tell me I had no business being there. For a while I thought I needed her to. Then one afternoon I realized I hadn't thought about getting an apology from her in several weeks. That felt better than receiving one probably would have. Mark and I started marriage counseling while I was still living in the apartment. He hated counseling for approximately the first 6 sessions. I know this because he announced it after everyone. I hate this, I gathered. Does she always have to ask what I was feeling? She's a therapist, Mark. I was feeling annoyed, she knows. By the 8th session, he stopped complaining. By the 10th, he said something I hadn't expected. He told our counselor that whenever Elaine or Denise wanted something, he had spent years asking himself which person would be easiest to disappoint. Usually that person was me. His explanation was almost worse than if he'd simply said he didn't care. He trusted me to be reasonable. He trusted me not to scream. He trusted me not to drag the entire family into an argument. So every time there was a choice between upsetting his mother and asking me to bend, I bent. Eventually he stopped noticing I was bending at all. I had some responsibility there too. Not for what he did with Bob's document. Not for the settlement agreement. Those choices belonged to him. But I had spent years saying it's fine when things weren't fine because I preferred a quiet Saturday to another Bennett Family Summit meeting. Peace can become a bad habit when only one person keeps paying for it. I didn't move home because Mark apologized. I watched him. There's a difference. One evening about 4 months after mediation, we were having dinner at a little Italian place near my apartment when Elaine called. Mark answered. I could hear her voice even from across the table. Something about Daniel. Something about another estate question. Then you need to tell Claire to call him. Mark looked at me. The old Mark would have covered the phone and said, "Can you just handle this?" Instead, he said, "Mom, talk to your attorney." Elaine's voice got louder. Claire understands this better than anybody. That was almost funny considering where we'd started. Mark said Claire isn't fixing this for us. Another burst of Elaine. Mom. No. Then he ended the call. He put his phone down. I took another bite of lasagna. He stared at me. What? Nothing. You're smiling. No, I'm not. You absolutely are. Eat your dinner. It was a small thing. That was exactly why I trusted it more than a speech. A month later, I started spending weekends at home again. Then 3 nights a week. We reviewed our finances together. We talked about boundaries with his family. We had conversations that should probably have happened during year 2 instead of year 11. I still kept the apartment for a while. Mark never asked when I was giving it up. That helped too. Something else changed during those months. I started missing work. Real work. Not the billing targets or clients calling at 4:55 on Friday afternoon with something that had apparently been an emergency since Tuesday. I missed sitting across from somebody who was frightened by a stack of paper and helping them understand what it actually meant. An old colleague introduced me to a small elder law and estate planning practice in Worthington. 3 days a week. Reasonable hours. People my age who understood that work-life balance shouldn't mean bringing your laptop on vacation. I said yes. One of my first clients was a widow in her late 60s whose husband had handled all their finances. She arrived with a grocery bag full of documents, not a folder, an actual Kroger bag. She put it on my desk. My son says I shouldn't worry about any of this. I looked inside. Bank statements, insurance forms, a deed, 2 beneficiary forms, and something from the county auditor. Well, I said I'm going to disagree with your son. She looked worried. Is something wrong? Maybe not. I pulled the first document out. But let's worry about the paperwork. She laughed. So did I. Near the first anniversary of Bob's death, I drove to the cemetery alone. It was a cool October morning, the kind Ohio does well before winter remembers it has a job. I had a photocopy folded inside my purse. 1 page from Bob's memorandum. Margaret had given it to me after the relevant estate issues were settled. I stood by his grave and unfolded it. There were no beautiful last words. Bob wasn't built that way. There were dates, account numbers, questions for Margaret. Then the line I'd read months earlier called Claire. She told me not to sign anything I don't understand. Good advice. Should have taken it sooner. I laughed quietly. Yeah, Bob. Probably. I folded the page again. For a long time I'd described what happened by saying I never told Mark's family I was a probate attorney. Standing there, I realized that wasn't quite accurate. I hadn't hidden it. They just hadn't been interested enough to ask. And if I was being fair, I'd helped them underestimate me. Not by lying, by deciding that correcting people was too exhausting. By making myself easier to overlook because being overlooked sometimes kept the peace. I wasn't doing that anymore. Bob's estate didn't make me rich. Denise didn't go to prison. Elaine didn't suddenly decide I was the daughter she'd always wanted. And Mark and I didn't walk out of counseling magically repaired. Life was less cooperative than that. But Denise had to account for what she'd done. Elaine had to live with the fact that protecting her daughter had helped make the problem worse. Mark had to stop calling avoidance loyalty, and I had to admit that being the reasonable person in a family didn't mean volunteering to be the person everybody could dismiss. 4 days after Bob died, Mark had sat beside me at Elaine's dining room table, while she pushed that agreement toward me. I'd started reading, and my husband had said, "You don't need to understand any of this." He was right about one thing. There had been something in that room I didn't understand. It just wasn't the paperwork. I understood that from the first paragraph. It was my marriage I had finally learned to read. If you've ever had someone mistake your patience for permission, you probably understand why that lesson stayed with me. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is read before you sign, whether it's a document or the people sitting across the table from you.